It was not the biggest mass killing in history, but it was the most intense. Certainly, head and shoulders above everything else. There was no escape in the case of this intentional killing. In the beginning of the war, there was a campaign in Germany to eliminate the mentally handicapped. And because of the protests from public opinion, from the churches also, they had to stop this. So they knew very well if they were going to start this against the Jewish population, many people, including many people who didn't like Jews, who were anti-Semite, but for whom, mass killing was a bridge too far, they will stand up against this. A few years ago, historians came out with the news that the story of Jesse Owens, an American black athlete who took part in the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and of whom it was usually claimed that Hitler refused to shake hands with him because he was black. That story turned out not to be true. In Europe, the problem of teachers who don't dare to, history teachers who don't dare to teach the history of the Holocaust anymore because their Muslim pupils don't tolerate it. In 2005, you also had a Holocaust denying conference organized by the Iranian government, by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad especially, in Tehran. The term negationism refers to the denial of not just any fact of history, but particularly of genocide. To deny the allegation of a genocide may either be correct or not. You see, sometimes a massacre that is alleged indeed never happened. For example, here in India, where I'm speaking from now, there is a fairly common allegation that Hindus did to Buddhists the same thing that Muslims did to Hindus, namely they removed them from territory, they destroyed their establishments, and also largely killed them. Now this is simply not true. And so it is quite correct to deny this supposed genocide. Islamic invaders destroyed the Buddhist universities in Bihar 1700 years after Buddhism came into existence. That is to say, Hindu kings had patronized, or at the very, very least tolerated them for 17 centuries. Okay, so there is no disappearance there at all. On a smaller scale, of course, you have it all the time, false allegations of involvement in murder. For example, the Christian propaganda that Brahmins martyred Saint Thomas near Chennai in the 1st century. That again is a completely false allegation. First of all, of course, Saint Thomas never went to South India. And secondly, we have a description that he was killed, but he was killed by a king somewhere in a Persian-speaking desert-like territory, somewhere in Afghanistan probably. And so he was killed Barughme with a spear, but since in Aramaic the vowels are not written, you could read these consonants also as Brahma, and that's what's being done. So of course in a sentence it would make no sense, but that's the art of propaganda. You can tell people, yeah, but there is something to it. And so this is false propaganda, and it's very correct to come out and deny it. It is blood libel. In the case of the Christians in India, in fact, quite striking. They came as refugees, they were given hospitality, and then they rewarded with this slander. I think that's bad form. But then the denial may be false, namely if the massacre did happen. Now, the two interact because the very existence of false genocide allegations is used by deniers of genocide to draw legitimacy from. And so in particular, first of all, we're dealing with the denial of the Holocaust. So what we're talking about is the Nazi intentional attempt to eliminate the Jews from Europe. First, they did so through emigration policies. There was no plan to kill them yet. But then when the war started, and especially when the war had moved to the attack against the Soviet Union, it became difficult or impossible to make them emigrate, and so a more radical solution was chosen. So the Holocaust is an event that essentially happened from 1941 to 1944. In the first months of 45, the Nazi regime was still in power, but it was already winding up this operation and trying to destroy the evidence. There are essentially three parts in the Holocaust. One is the killing by neck shots, mostly, of Jewish prisoners taken behind the lines that were advancing into the Soviet Union, 1941-42. So there was an order to kill all the resistors, all the partisans, but Jews were ipso facto deemed to be resistors, and therefore they should all be shot, women and children included. Then there were camps specially designed for the purpose, elimination camps, like Treblinka, Sobibor and Majdanek in Poland. And then there was Auschwitz, which is a special case. It's not simply an elimination camp. It started as a labor camp. And so this was an important industrial center that was planned to become the capital, so to speak, of the state in the state, which the SS was setting up. The SS, the elite corps that actually planned the Holocaust and executed it. It was not the biggest mass killing in history, but it was the most intense. Certainly, head and shoulders above everything else. There was no escape in the case of this intentional killing. The Jews could not escape through conversion, for example. Many tried that, converting to Christianity. That didn't count. So it was the genocide par excellence. As for the term, Jews nowadays prefer the term Shoah, destruction, because Holocaust is actually a biblical term, and it refers to a specific kind of sacrifice. You see, in most sacrifices, an animal was offered to a deity, then later ritually eaten by the sacrificers. In this case, the sacrificial animal was burned. And so this burning, served as an image to the destruction process in the camps. So the term négationnisme in French was launched in 1987 by historian Henri Rousseau. And so it meant ideology of denial, but specifically ideology of Holocaust denial. So the first one post-war who started with this denial was a journalist teacher called Paul Racinier. He was actually a resistor. He was an anti-Nazi. He was taken captive and imprisoned in Buchenwald. Now, Buchenwald was not an elimination camp. It was simply a camp where prisoners were held till further notice. And so initially, in his publications after 1945, he doesn't deny the Holocaust. But he does deny the gas chambers, which had been claimed. Initially, there were all kinds of stories. People didn't know exactly what had happened. They knew it was terrible. So there were stories that there were gas chambers also in Buchenwald. He had been in Buchenwald. He hadn't seen any of those. So he denied that. He took part in polemics, like, for example, the Pope during the war, Pope Pius XII, was often accused of being an accomplice in the Holocaust. He defended the Pope. He tried to answer that because the Catholic Church actually did what it could, more or less, to hide Jews, to protect them, to give false papers and so on. When the first historians' study of the Holocaust came out, Raoul Hilberg's book, The Destruction of the European Jews in 1961, he tried to answer that. You see, now the debate became official, and his reluctance to accept the more common account became real Holocaust negationism. And so he starts to try techniques that were later more common among negationists, like he said that, yes, you see, many Jews had disappeared from Europe during the war years, or at least if you compare the demographic figures with of the 30s with those of the late 40s or 50s. Yes, obviously millions of Jews had disappeared, but he gave an innocuous explanation. He said, yeah, but they had all emigrated. Of course, historians would in that case try to look for proof of that. How many Jews had in the 1930s, before the war, disappeared from Germany, had been scrapped from the population register. Have the house prices in New York or in Buenos Aires suddenly gone up because there was a great demand by newcomers, and so on. All these things could be researched. Now, he was not a professional historian at that time. Also, it was a great investment to go find all this information. In that sense, you can somewhat forgive his poor argumentation. Nevertheless, it is the start of full-on Holocaust denial. There's another book from the early years that is often mentioned here, Nuremberg ou la terre promise. Nuremberg, which is the place where the trial of the Nazi leaders took place, or The Promised Land. So that's a book by Maurice Bardèche. And I've read it long ago, and I found, to my surprise, that actually it is not a negationist book, not fully. At that time, because the information about the Holocaust was not yet very clear, all kinds of stories went around. And so French resistors claimed that the Germans had planned the extermination of the French people. And so against that he reacts. He says, yes, of course we know that the Jews were marked for extermination, but not the French people, which is correct. So there was no attempt to eliminate the others, but especially the Jews, and then a few others, the Gypsies, for instance, but not the French people. Bardèche, of course, had a bad name. He became an open neo-fascist. Indeed, he wrote a book called What is Fascism? Trying to recruit people to the fascist cause. But so, strictly speaking, he illustrates the fact that negationism took a few decades to really develop, at least among non-Nazis. Because in a way, the whole negationist project started already during the Nazi regime. Namely, at the end, when they saw they were losing the war, they tried to destroy as much evidence as possible. So in that sense, the attempt already started. And then among common Germans, of course, it was hard to accept the collective guilt for the Holocaust. So then many of the camp followers also started developing this rhetoric. Still in France, which for a long time was really the heartland of negationism, the lead was taken by Robert Faurisson. He was a literature historian, and he was a specialist of romantic forgeries. You see, this is a specific phenomenon that in the Romantic period, people tried to create for their own nation a glorious past. And so they invented epics supposedly written in the dim and distant past, but in fact contemporary. For example, Ossian in the case of the Scots, or the Ura Linda book in the case of the Frisians in the Netherlands. So those were forgeries, and so he knew a lot about that. And so he applied his methods to an important Holocaust document, the Diary of Anne Frank. She was the daughter of a German businessman who had gotten embroiled in a scandal. So he left Germany and he resettled in Amsterdam, where she grew up. And so when the persecution of the Jews started, they were hiding in an annex to a house in Amsterdam, which you can still visit. And then they were betrayed, and the whole family, so she, her sister, her father and mother, were taken to Auschwitz. Now there, things happened which in fact the negationists could have used. You see, the story of the Holocaust is that many Jews were killed. Now they were not killed. Of the 4, not one was killed. And so when the Soviet army was approaching, the prisoners got a choice either to remain there and wait for whatever would happen, or to join the Germans fleeing westwards. And so that's what she did, was taken to the camp of Bergen-Belsen in what used to be West Germany. And she was there, and she and her sister and her mother all died of disease. Because at the end of the war, you see, there were no communications, no transport anymore in Germany. So to transport food to the camps, especially at a moment when everybody else was also starving, had become very difficult, and especially the provision of medicine. So diseases could not be treated anymore. So the death toll was enormous. So they were not killed, they just died from a disease. Of course, if they hadn't been in the camp, probably they wouldn't have contracted this disease, they wouldn't have died. So it's not that the Germans were innocent, but nevertheless, it's not strictly according to the book of the Holocaust. The father, moreover, survived. He stayed in Auschwitz and he survived. So you see, that they could have used easily to say, oh, see, you know, there was nothing wrong with Auschwitz. People survived there. And at any rate, he did survive. And he came back to Amsterdam after the war. And then he edited the diary of his daughter and had it published. So it became a big success, but he had changed it a little bit. In particular, you see, when she talks about herself, about her puberty, about, you know, discovering the sexual dimension of life especially, those things were washed away, they were taken out. So it really makes no difference to her story of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Nevertheless, this man, Robert Faurisson, used it to say, oh, this is a falsification, this is a forgery. So that's how it started. Then he really got into all other aspects of the negationist argument. Like he has this book, Mémoire en défense, so a memorandum in my defense, which had a foreword by Noam Chomsky, the famous American linguist and intellectual. So Chomsky later, of course, made it clear it doesn't mean that I support Holocaust denial. It only means that I'm in favor of freedom of speech. You see, Faurisson is wrong in denying the Holocaust, but nevertheless he has a right to say it. A right which in France at that time was being challenged. Then around him you had a number of other deniers like Serge Tiemon, and you had there the interesting phenomenon of leftist negationism. You see, you had not only neo-Nazis and such who were denying the Holocaust, you had also leftists who denied it. And there was a reason for that. You see, they saw how Hollywood and other Western cultural centers, the Western education system, were making a big thing out of the Holocaust, which, in their opinion, served to make a distinction between two forms of capitalism, the Nazi form of capitalism versus the Western, Anglo-American form of capitalism, with the message that while there is an evil capitalism, there is a good capitalism. And so these leftists said, no, there is no good capitalism. And, the British, the Americans, the French are just as prone to committing genocide whenever they're put in the circumstances where this would be useful to them. And proof is, of course, the many massacres committed by the colonial powers or by the Americans while dispossessing the Native Americans. So there the message was, well, they're all evil, so there's no point in stressing the evil of the Nazis. And indeed, to some extent, it's not even true. It's, propped up by American propaganda. Another strange thing about this group of deniers is that they were equally skeptical about other genocides, like the Armenian genocide committed in the First World War by the Turks, and the Cambodian genocide committed by the Khmer Rouge regime in 1975-79. So there too they say, well, this people have a tendency to exaggerate, and so this is what happened in those cases as well. So in the 80s and 90s, negationism was a big movement with names like Jürgen Graf, Ernst Zundel, Mark Weber of the Californian Institute of Historical Review, Germar Rudolph, a German chemist, and Siegfried Verbeke, who is from my country, whom I have interviewed. So he's not anything big, he's just a businessman. But nevertheless, he was the most active denier in our country. Then, since we are now going over the facts of the negationist movement, we might also draw attention to a few other names. One name that you will often find in public sources as a denier is David Cole from Beverly Hills, California, himself a Jew. He minimizes the exact figure of the death toll of the Holocaust, and he criticizes some of the claims made about Auschwitz. And so that has earned him the name of denier, which I think is incorrect. So he accepts the fact of the Holocaust. He says that it had killed about 3.5 million Jews instead of the established figure of 5.3 million Jews. So after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, he visited the camps in Poland, and he interviewed the director of Auschwitz, which had become a museum. And so he found that much of what was being claimed there, that tourists were fed, did not add up, it was not correct. And some things are fake, like there was a so-called gas chamber shown to tourists, this is where it happened, that was actually built after the war. So he found some fault with Auschwitz as he found it, which made him very popular in denier circles. And so he's often described as a denier, but I think wrongly. He then gave up the whole scene, he broke with it, and he tried to start a new life under his pseudonym because, reputed to be a denier, he could not find work. So he started to work for the Republican Party under a false name. But he was outed and then he was again without a job. So today he's a columnist for the right-wing magazine Taki. But so today he regularly does podcasts and so on, where he goes straight against the deniers and shows where they are wrong. And of course, he's generally far better in showing the mistakes made by the negationists because he knows the matter through and through. So indeed, you see, to remedy the problem of negationism, he's one of the best voices because he knows the matter. He has a lot of credibility among the deniers, yet he goes straight against their message. Something similar counts for David Irving. David Irving was a dropout from history studies. He went to work in Germany as a builder, a mason, and so he got to know many ex-Nazis. This was not too long after the war. Most people who had lived through it were still alive. And so he became a very respected historian of World War II. However, around 1980, he got embroiled in denial, and he became a very explicit negationist. You can say this here is not exaggerated at all. A Jewish scholar from Atlanta, Deborah Lipstadt, accused him of being a denier. And so he tried to use the British libel law against her, but he lost the trial. So then he was like officially categorized as a denier. Moreover, in 2005, he was imprisoned for 1 year while visiting Austria. Again, accused of being a denier. Interestingly, in the last few years, he has practically converted. And so he has written a path-breaking work about Heinrich Himmler, the actual mastermind of the Holocaust, and about his diary. And so he shows exactly how the Holocaust was organized, you see, what it meant in the mind of the perpetrators. Also how it was kept secret, how all the people involved had to swear an oath of secrecy. After the war, it became, usual to lampoon the Germans who said, "Oh, wir haben das nicht gewusst." We didn't know this, what was happening in our name. But actually, that's to a large extent correct. You see, the intention was to keep it secret. In the beginning of the war, there was a campaign in Germany to eliminate the mentally handicapped. And because of the protests from public opinion, from the churches also, they had to stop this. So they knew very well if they were going to start this against the Jewish population, many people, including many people who didn't like Jews, who were anti-Semite, but for whom, mass killing was a bridge too far, they will stand up against this. So therefore we have to do it without public opinion knowing about it. So they did this in utmost secrecy. So here you have the same phenomenon. David Irving, having been a dyed-in-the-wool negationist, nevertheless now makes himself useful in showing precisely what the weak points, the untenable message of negationism really is. How is negationism being organized? So there are a number of different techniques regarding different arguments. A very common one is clutching at the straw of small successes. For example, a few years ago, historians came out with the news that the story of Jesse Owens, an American black athlete who took part in the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and of whom it was usually claimed that Hitler refused to shake hands with him because he was black. That story turned out not to be true. In fact, at that time, in the states, in the southern states of the United States, so where he came from, society was still far more segregated and racist than what he encountered in Germany. Now, I don't know if this says something about the Germans, but they did not constantly live with a black population, so they were not trained to be in practice racist. And so they had these, a few black people and a few Chinese and so on coming over for these Olympics for a few days. And they were all tutored to be very generous to them and so on, to give a very good impression of Germany. So it may not prove so much, but actually, from his short time in Germany, Jesse Owens had a good impression. And so the reason, why Hitler didn't shake hands with him is that he had shaken hands with athletes, with winning athletes the first day. And then the Olympic Committee had told him, you see, this is not a protocol. You should keep a distance from everyone. And so the second day he didn't shake hands with anyone, including this Jesse Owens. So the negationists said at that time, see, this is what we've always said. Well, yeah, in this case, you can't deny this is a small success of theirs. Nevertheless, it had nothing to do with the Holocaust. You see, it had a little bit to do with the image of Hitler, of the Nazi movement, but it's not about the persecution of the Jews. Then they play up the crimes by the winning side, by the Allies. For example, there's a book by a Canadian writer, James Buck, that is called Other Losses. So that means the other losses are, you see, some people that died of disease, some people died in war activity, and so on. Some people were killed as prisoners or died in prison and so on. You have all these other categories, and then you have other losses. Those that don't belong in any of these categories. This refers to German soldiers who did not get the status of war prisoner and were left to die by the American or French authorities. So the number, of course, he says it's 100,000. I don't know about the number. So there is something to it. But again, you see, it makes no difference at all to the reality of the Holocaust. Or, another thing that is often cited in the novel Night, Elie Wiesel, a Nobel Prize winner, describes effectively that as a released prisoner, immediately after the war, he and his friends went to town to rape German girls. And so they say, yeah, they look horrible. So even if it is true, nevertheless, it still doesn't say anything about the reality of the Holocaust. Then you have the fact that there are abuses. You see, it is now fashionable to be a Holocaust victim or have something to do with it. And so there are a number of people like Benjamin Wilkomirski or my compatriot Monique de Waele, who have falsely launched the story that they themselves were Holocaust victims, which they turned out not to be. Then a very common thing is to present an exception as the rule. I mean, this is perhaps the main technique that is being used, and vice versa, the rule as an exception. So this is to magnify anything useful or to minimize anything, any evidence that doesn't fit your narrative. As for the motive, why do people do this? You see, very rarely are they lies. So you see, some people out of anti-Semitism may feel like, yes, you see, let's slander the Jews, including let's falsely accuse them of slandering us or of slandering the Nazis at any rate. So this is not impossible, this certainly has happened, but you see, in most cases it is wishful thinking. People really believe that there had been no Holocaust because they want it like that. You see, either, you know, they're Germans, they have self-respect and they just don't want this stain on their reputation, you know, or otherwise, you know, out of ideological conviction, they want to whitewash National Socialism. And so they really believe that. Why? I mean, how can we be so sure about that? The thing is that outing yourself as a Holocaust denier has an enormous social cost. You see, finding work is out of the question. You know, everybody will shun you. You cannot talk about anything else anymore because you're totally identified with your denier message. And so if people nevertheless do that, it's because they really believe in it. You see, you don't do that for fun. You don't do that just, you know, to tell a story. That's something you do because you really believe it. And so you see on Twitter and so on, I see, not just in this debate, in every debate possible, you see people all the time accusing others of lying. You are a liar. Now, while of course lies do exist, you see, in most cases this is not appropriate. People actually believe what they say. You know, even if it's strange and indefensible things, usually they say them because they really believe them. That also explains why you get conversions away from negationism. You see, after a while, when people start to see that there are really reasons to accept the fact of the Holocaust, then they convert away from negationism. Like, for example, I just mentioned the case of David Irving. There's a Sanskritist I used to know, he died a few years ago, a Danish scholar called Christian Lindner. He was also very much a denier. At the end of his life, he changed his mind. And I mean, I've seen him change his mind in the sense of, you know, it was a heartfelt change of mind. He was not just saying that. You know, he himself became convinced, well, yes, of course, there was a Holocaust. In some countries, there is a legislation against Holocaust denial. In Germany, of course, but also in France and indeed in Belgium, it is a punishable offense to deny or to minimize the Holocaust or to justify the Holocaust. Because there are also people who say, yeah, of course, Hitler killed the Jews, only he didn't kill enough of them. And that opinion is also very much there. Indeed, at the moment you hear it a lot with the polarization around Palestine. You see, in Muslim circles, you know, you hear that argument a lot. That, you know, what Hitler did was a good thing, only he didn't go far enough. But so that's also forbidden. this is a bad idea for a number of reasons. Like, for instance, I mentioned that minimizing it is forbidden. Now, what is minimizing? You see, scholars do differ in opinion about the numbers involved. This is a perfectly normal thing about historians. So they themselves say, what is this? You see, am I now not allowed anymore to, to exercise my profession? It's used as an argument by the negationists themselves. Namely, they say, well, this prohibition proves that the establishment has to hide something, that they have to keep us from speaking out because they can't answer. Yeah, that's a very common thing that is said in those circles. Moreover, it so happens historically that it has blazed the trail for more muzzling laws, for more legislation prohibiting certain opinions. In France, there are now 4 different opinions that are protected by law that you can't challenge. One is the Armenian Holocaust. One is the history of colonialism, which again has some established official version that you can't challenge, at least not by law. And there is a 4th one. So I'd say that, on principle, free speech absolutism is an absolute necessity to have a democracy. I mean, forbidding certain opinions, the utterance of certain opinions, or the fact of informing oneself of others' opinions, that free exchange of opinions is necessary for democracy, because you can't form rational judgment if you don't have the facts of the matter. And moreover, it divides the population into classes, those who are not allowed to know, and those who can decide what you are allowed to know and what not, and who of course do know. And so I think it's a very bad idea. Then it creates an impression, that it also very much has done, that any dissident theories about World War II are taboo. For example, in 2008, there was a book by Pat Buchanan, a former Republican candidate for the presidency in America, who said that it was a mistake, not only for America, but even earlier for England, to enter the war. And so at that time in England, 1939, there was a strong body of opinion, especially in the ruling class, not to go to war with Germany, even when they had invaded Poland, because I said, well, if it's a local war, it's a pity it shouldn't be there, but we should not get involved. And so this was the generation that had, as young men, fought in the trenches in World War I. You see, they were more pacifist than most. And so you see that that opinion was overruled by Churchill once he came to power. While already earlier, Chamberlain, his predecessor, is often lampooned as someone who sold out, or who was willingly fooled by the Germans in the Munich Agreement in 1938. But actually he started the war, he went to war. The day after the Germans invaded Poland, he declared war on Germany. So you see that desire to go to war, even if not with full conviction, but they thought it was necessary, it was honorable to go to war, that prevailed. Now Buchanan said, if they had thought more carefully about the consequences, they would, or they should at least not have done it. And so today that is a very unorthodox view. Everybody thinks this was a holy war. This was a Dharma Yuddha, this had to be fought and won. So in India you have, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, who didn't think so, even though he himself had fought for, or had joined in the British war effort, in the Boer War in South Africa, in the Zulu War in South Africa, and in the First World War. which was a total waste. I mean, a very useless war. Yet, you see, in the Second World War, he wrote letters to Hitler imploring him, to desist from war, or once it has started to, retreat and give up the war. So you could argue for that. For example, it has been argued that this would have averted the Holocaust, because the Holocaust only started in war circumstances. This was not planned. Like I know a historian in my country who said in some TV debate, yeah, you know that the Nazis committed the Holocaust. You only have to read Mein Kampf to know that. Well, actually, there is no such thing in Mein Kampf. In the early Nazi ideological statements, there is no plan of a Holocaust. The initial plan was to remove the Jews from Europe. That's the meaning of Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jewish question is to remove the Jews from Europe. So you had the Madagascar plan and other plans. Then you had an effective cooperation with the Zionist movement to let Jews from Germany move to Palestine. I mean, anyway, there were different plans. Then when the invasion of the Soviet Union started, they intended to resettle the Jews in the conquered territories. And indeed, a beginning was made with that. There is a fairly famous case of a train that went from Stuttgart to Estonia, I believe, where people were, allowed to take their tools and so on with them. The government provided for everything necessary to build a new city, a new community in the east. This was well publicized, and so later, when people did not go to build anything but to actually go to the camps to be exterminated, then this past experience was also used to create confidence in the people. You see, the Jews are disappearing from your cities, not because anything is happening to them, but remember the Jews from Stuttgart, because they are taken away and start a new life there. So, this is part of the secrecy policy. People were being misled. But so by the time the war started, you see, all the other options became questionable. And so then the SS decided on a more radical solution. But so the reaction to this book, I've read a number of reviews of it, is a bit extreme. It's not what you would expect from a discussion among historians. Why? Because the Second World War, the war against the Nazis, has acquired this status of a holy war that you really can't question. So you see, that phenomenon is exacerbated by the existence of these prohibitive laws. When in England, Prime Minister Tony Blair proposed to the Jewish community to have a similar law prohibiting this, they refused. They said very wisely that Jews have had a good time in England precisely because of its liberal climate, precisely because of its freedom, and so we don't want to be the ones who start violating that freedom. Instead, the Holocaust Remembrance Day was enacted, but so no prohibition of Holocaust denial. But of course, it is very much ostracized everywhere. It has social consequences. Nevertheless, it is also being very openly announced. You see, in the West now, it is a dying movement. It's only practiced by alcoholics with tattoos on their body and so on. All the scholars that actually worked for it, have either died or have changed their minds. There's very little of it that remains. but it is wildly popular among Muslims. And so we have in Europe the problem of teachers who don't dare to, history teachers who don't dare to teach the history of the Holocaust anymore because their Muslim pupils don't tolerate it. In 2005, you also had a Holocaust denying conference organized by the Iranian government, by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad especially, in Tehran. There are, of course, other genocides. And so this is as old as humanity, or at least certainly thousands of years old. For example, in India there is a lot of discussion about the Aryan invasion. Well, I don't know about any Aryan invasion of India, but the Aryan invasion of Europe is very much a historical fact and a very bloody one. So you see now with genetics it's all very easy to verify that the native population was violently replaced with the Aryan newcomers, almost 5,000 years ago. You have the biblical example, and of course some people doubt that it was historical. Nevertheless, that's what the Bible says, that in entering the promised land, Joshua, the successor of Moses, killed the whole native population to replace them with the Israelites. So it's questionable whether it's historical, but at any rate, that's what's written in the Bible. This should be distinguished from ethnocide. Ethnocide means that you eliminate a people as a specific ethnic identity. So you let the people live, but not in group, not with a distinctive language and so on. Like, for example, when the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern part of the Israelite territory, they deported the Jewish tribes living there, spread them through their empire, and made sure that they disappeared by mixing with the rest. So now, thanks to genetics, we can verify that in that Assyrian Empire, mostly in what is now Kurdistan, the population is the most genetically related to the Israelite population. Presently, this ethnocide is claimed especially in the People's Republic of China, in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and so on. Another thing to realize is the war factor. To actually just go in and commit genocide is a really special, especially hard case. You see, mostly it is in war circumstances that human sensitivity is erodes, is diminished, and that more and more extreme acts of armed aggression become possible. For example, in my own country and around it, a number of Celtic and Germanic tribes were exterminated by Julius Caesar when he Romanized this whole area. Genghis Khan, the famous Mongol conqueror, and his grandson Hülegu, who conquered the Middle East, they killed millions. But especially when these millions resisted, when they simply gave themselves up, the policy of the Mongols was less radical. Muhammad killed a few people who opposed him, especially two of the Jewish tribes in Medina. And so here we're not speaking of millions, only of hundreds, but still, he killed all the men of the Banu Qurayza tribe, and he took the women and children as slaves, including one of the women whom he induced in his own harem. But so there is no genocidal policy against Jews as such, because he also allowed another tribe to survive, but he exiled them. He forced them to leave, which is exactly what the Nazis had also planned to do. Then you have the Armenian genocide of 1915. This was the first genocide to be called a Holocaust, a complete fire sacrifice, because in one episode, an Armenian population had sought refuge in the city, and the city was besieged by the Turks, and instead of taking the trouble of conquering it, they simply set it on fire. So that way they could deal with the Armenians. An example that is less well known is the Dzungar Mongols in 1759. They were killed, at least 80% of them, by the Emperor of China, at the request apparently of their neighbors, the Uyghurs, who are still in the news today. And there also you see, just like in the Nazi Holocaust, the propaganda preparation where these people earmarked for genocide is described as subhuman. And so the death toll was quite serious, about 800,000. Now often genocides are justified as defensive. Like for instance in 1994, you had in Rwanda the Hutus who killed all the Tutsis. But you see, this was at a time when a border area had already been occupied by the Tutsis who had fled to a neighboring country and now tried to reconquer Rwanda. And so the Rwandan Hutu tribe was afraid that they would again be subdued by the Tutsi tribe, and so they killed all the Tutsis that they could lay their hand on. In a way, you see, this was also a factor in the Holocaust. In the Nazi propaganda, it was always emphasized that the Jews are a great danger. And so that the slogan was Deutsche wehrt euch. You know, Germans, defend yourself. It was portrayed as defensive, just as the German invasion of Poland in 1939 was also portrayed as defensive. They claimed that the Polish were on the attack and that Germany had to defend itself. Okay, so in Europe, you know, the active phase of Holocaust denial is over, but it has a mass following among Muslims. In 2005, you had this conference in Tehran, which invited all the European deniers who were still alive. There was also, surprisingly, a presence from Israel, namely Orthodox rabbis. And their reason is interesting. You see, they objected to the fact that the Holocaust had become the center of Jewish identity. Many Jews who are no longer religious, no longer practice Judaism, no longer believe in the Bible, nevertheless keep on defending themselves, defining themselves as Jews, with the main reference point being the Holocaust, the memory. So these Orthodox want Jews to focus on the Torah, not on this memory of the Holocaust. From India, there was also someone present, namely the Dalit crusader V.T. Rajashekar Shetty, who publishes this paper Dalit Voice, now I think taken over by his son. And so he has two lines of propaganda. One is to call the Hindus, and particularly the Brahmins, as Hindu Nazis. And on the other hand, he accuses them of being the Jews of India. And indeed, the anti-Brahmin propaganda in India is quite similar to the anti-Jewish propaganda of the 1930s in Germany. You have the phenomenon of mass famines, where people are not being killed by weapons, but where they are starved to death. You have in particular the Holodomor in Ukraine, the famine genocide, where Stalin intentionally killed millions of Ukrainians. There's a debate how many. Walter Duranty, the journalist of the New York Times, who at that time denied the killing that was going on because he coveted having an interview with Stalin himself. He privately estimated the death toll at 10 million. You know, other estimates are a bit lower, but at any rate, you know, there were many who were being killed. And this, of course, then served the Nazi propaganda when they had to justify why they were anti-communist and invading the Soviet Union and so on. They reminded people, you know, look at the massacre that the communists have committed. In China, you had the Great Leap Forward, which was probably the largest human-made mass death in human history, where the estimated death toll is at least 30 million, up to 46 million. And yet this was not a genocide. You see, Mao Zedong did not want to kill the farmers. He certainly did not want to kill the Chinese people. You know, this was collateral damage. He had foolish economic policies, and because of the fierce communist regime, the lower authorities did not dare to report the catastrophe that was happening to the center leadership that just continued this policy. So for a few years, policies led to famines, and ultimately there were tens of millions of people killed, or at least who had died. And so you can't really say they were killed, but they were somehow forced to die by this policy. So the biggest man-made famine in world history was not a genocide. It happened by accident. Likewise, in Cambodia, did Pol Pot intend to exterminate all the Cambodians? Well, of course not. He only meant to eliminate the bourgeoisie, though it was very easy to be classed as such. Anyone who wore glasses, for example, or who could speak a foreign language was deemed an intellectual and lost to the cause, and so up for elimination. And there are other massacres that, you know, are largely collateral damage. For example, when the Spanish and the Portuguese entered America, a very large percentage of the native population died because of disease. Now, later on, there are a few cases where these diseases are very purposely spread, like you see blankets that had served, you know, people who had the disease that were deemed infected, they were given, and so they spread the disease. But you see, in many cases, the disease spread by itself. Like, for example, one city was conquered by the Spanish, the next city was not, but someone went about his business traveling from the one city to the other and then back home. Now, he took the germs with him, and so the people in his hometown died massively without ever having seen any Spanish conquistador. I mean, those things also happen. So to a large extent, this is collateral damage. You could argue the same thing about the Bengal famine. You see, the British did not have an intention of killing people, the people who produced for their own war economy, after all. But nevertheless, they pursued policies that had as effect that this famine took place. Sometimes, of course, spreading disease is a case of biological warfare, like the occurrence of the pest, the plague in Europe in the Middle Ages was a consequence of biological warfare on a very small scale. You see, there was an Italian trading post at the Black Sea that was being besieged by the Mongols, And so at some point, the Mongols catapulted the dead bodies of diseased people into the city. And so this way the disease spread. Then some refugees from the city took the boat back to Italy and took the germs with them. Similarly, King Leopold in Congo, in about 1890, 1900, he exploited his own laborers to death. But it's not true that he wanted to kill the people who were making him rich. I mean, that's now a common story, that he was a great genocide committer and so on. His policies again caused death without ever having wanted this. I mean, there are, it's a complex history, it's not a whole story, but mostly you see it is a case of collateral damage.